Welcome. This is CWJah Talk number 9. My name is Greg Stafford, and I present these Saturday live discussion shows for the Christian witnesses of Jah, those who believe in three things: the God Jah, Jesus as the real historical Messiah, the one about whom people like Moses and others wrote, and that we should treat others the way we want to be treated. And so, naturally, we believe we have to get along with pretty much everybody, except those who are openly hostile to us or to others, or who just have different personalities in ways that, don't always mix with certain individuals. Even in some of the Christian writings that we use, we find individuals who had disagreements, what the Bible calls sharp bursts of anger over issues that they couldn't fully resolve, and so they separated. So not everybody gets along. We know that. And but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, or that we can't have certain standards for how we can interact socially in spite of our personal views, in spite of our religious views, in spite of our secular views, non-religious views. We all live in the same world. And so to the extent that we can get along, we should. It sometimes is difficult because the differences between our views are at times sensitive, or they involve things that are very personal to us, and that have a great meaning. And so when we have disagreements over things like that, it's not as easy to just set them aside and get along otherwise. But we can do it. Okay, but one way we believe is best to do that is to have an understanding of each other. As Christian witnesses of Jah, and I think as people in general, having an understanding of why a person does something. We can't read into people's hearts, minds. We don't fully know everyone's intention, right? Only they do. Only if they exist, the spirits do, if they can see those things. We believe they do. But we're not going to get into that today. We're going to talk about things related to religion, but more so involving humans, and the things that as humans we are allowed to do, but that have either consequences or rewards, right? So think of the things that you like to do, some of the things you like to do, some activities. They're usually things that bring you joy, that make you happy, that give you some level of fulfillment in your life. And then think of some of the things that you avoid, things that you purposefully say no to or avoid because of the effect that they have on you, or the effect that they may have on someone else, someone close to you, your children, your family, your friends. Okay, it's important that I just ask that question for each of us to consider so that you reflect on your own something that fits both those categories for you, right? And then I do the same for me, and I can appreciate things I like to do and things I don't like to do. Okay, one of the things that most adults like to do is have sex. That doesn't mean everybody does. And of course, many youths, I'm not saying only adults do, but I'm talking about adults who in a more controlled environment, who have the opportunities that many youths don't have to pursue a sexual relationship. And so naturally, as Christians and Jews, of course, who believe in the Hebrew Scriptures, some of the sexual interests that people who are not Christian or who are not Jewish adherents to things like Moses' writings, some of the sexual interests that people have who aren't Christian or Jewish conflict with the sexual interests of some Jews and Christians. And so the result is we cannot have a completely fulfilling relationship with some people because we have differences of opinion about one of the things, sex, that is very much a part of intimate relationships and also necessary for things like reproduction. Sex is important both from a pleasurable perspective. We like it because we enjoy it. But it's also important because it helps maintain the human species. It is the means by which we reproduce. So, where do the conflicts come in? Well, the good news is we are all sexuals, okay? Even other than special cases, I get there are conditions people may have where you don't have any, maybe may not have any sexual desire. I'm not referring to those individuals who may be special exceptions. I'm talking about based on the normal manner of reproduction that human beings have an interest in sex for both pleasure and reproduction. But once we realize we're all sexuals, it's easy because we're not making a separation between the kind of sex that we have an interest in having. Now, once we qualify that, okay, once we qualify sexual, like you see in the title, I put dash sexuals in quotes because you do not often hear the word sexuals or sexual other than as an adjective describing a person. That person is sexual. I'm talking about a category of persons. So we know there is a category of persons called heterosexuals. Okay, now we've further qualified sexuals in terms of the category or class of persons. We're all sexuals, meaning we have an interest in sex, I think. Other than the special exceptions where we maybe have conditionally, their condition may not be the same as most humans. Most human male and females are sexual and have an interest in having sex for both pleasure and reproduction, or at least one, right? I mean, some people may not have a real interest in reproducing or having children, but they want to have sex because it's pleasurable. Okay, so sex in the sexual sense has both the pleasurable aspect and the benefit of being able to reproduce and maintain the species, have offspring, which are obviously of great value in a normal world, and even in a world where it's complicated and where we have to deal with difficulty. Having children is much better than not having children, I would say. So the benefits are there for all of us as sexuals. We can have pleasurable interaction, relations with someone else, and we can reproduce. Those are two significant, if not two of the most significant benefits, desires, interests of human beings, right? The pleasure desire and the benefit that comes or results from this particular pleasure. Reproduction, reproducing your species, growing your family, and cultivating the earth. All right, so now we qualified it a minute ago, or I did, with heterosexuals. And so we start out with sexuals. We're all in that, okay? No distinction yet made between those who prefer sex with members of the opposite gender. We'll talk about gender in a moment briefly, but for the moment, let's work with the male-female gender model, which is, again, the primary classification according to our DNA that people make when it comes to the reproduction of human beings through sex. So, you have the heterosexuals who will want, hetero being the Greek word for other. So other sexuals, that it means people who have an interest in sex with someone of the other gender. And so male, female. Now, you can go further and qualify sexuals with B-I, bisexual. Most of us, I'm sure, have heard and met someone who may be bisexual. So bisexual, bi meaning two or both. A person who would be in that category or describe themselves that way would typically be one who's attracted to both male and female. And of course, being either male or female themselves, or him or herself, that would mean that they're willing to have or have an interest in having or are attracted to a member of their own sex, their own gender, the same gender that they are, as well as a member of the other gender. So you could have a man, bisexual, and he has an interest in both, or an attraction to other men and women. And then, of course, we know of the term homosexual. Homo meaning, in Greek, the same or same, similar, of the same type of thing. Same thing, same, similar. And so persons in the category of homosexuals are those who have a sexual interest or attraction to members of the same gender. There's not really a similar gender. I understand there's a gender spectrum, and again, we'll talk a little bit about that later. This isn't really a gender identity show, although we will talk a little bit about it, in particular when we get to transgenders, because that's really the gender aspect of this show, or where I will introduce it a little bit more. But with homosexuals, so it could be a male or a female, a male or a female who has an interest or an attraction to sexually a member of their same gender. So male to male, female to female. And then you have pansexuals. So pansexuals, we've all heard or saw, of course, famous singer and former TV series actress, I guess you could say, Miley Cyrus, describe herself as a pansexual. Others have done that, but it seems ever since she did it, it's kind of taken off a little bit more, or become more trendy, I guess I want to say. Although, again, this isn't like it's brand new. And of course, you had the Han Solo movie where I believe it was the writer who said that his idea for Lando Calrissian was that he was a pansexual. And of course, the actor Donald Glover Jr. Kind of went with that, right? And he played it the way he thought best, and basically went with it. So that's fine. People are, as Christians, it's very important that we do not try to force, or I would say even make people feel bad about their choices. I don't mean that we should go around catering to people who we think make bad choices, nor am I saying that we should withhold our true belief about the thing people are doing we think is bad, right? Because obviously if we don't do it, we don't believe it's good for us or for somebody else. There's a reason people don't do something, right? And most of the time, it's because we believe that something is bad for us or harmful to another person. So there's a range, obviously, of things. We all do things. I mean, you could say that eating too much saturated fat is bad for you, right? But unless you're forcing somebody else to eat saturated fat, I mean, it's really just your own personal choice and habit. We're going to make a distinction between things like eating too much bad food, even drinking or smoking, things that aren't necessarily good for you, but that, especially in excess, but that people get to choose to do, depending on what we're talking about, and what really anything, and then answer for themselves, right? We all have to make choices and then take the responsibility for our choices and accept the consequences, good or bad. But when we do something that is harmful to another person, that's different, right? It changes it from being a personal choice about what you want to do with your body to what you're choosing to do to another person's body, and what effects that might have on their emotions, their state of mind, their psychology, their spirituality. Now, of course, with homosexuality, and of course bisexuality, where it involves the homosexual component, and pansexuality, really, with almost anything but a member of the opposite gender, sex that is, you're going to have a situation where the sex is more than likely going to be damaging. Okay, so we're not going to get into too much description, But I'm not going to avoid describing what we all already know is involved in some of the things that people are saying it's okay to practice. So we need to talk about that. We need to talk about what is it that they're saying is okay, what is it that we're being asked to accept, and should we practice these things? Are we missing out, on some form of sex that's actually good, right? Who doesn't like sex? If you are able to have it and it's not a problem for you, we were made to have sex. It says right there in Genesis, according to our view, the primary thing Jah made for us was the earth and to fill it, to become fruitful, become many, and to fill the earth. We weren't even circumcised at that point because the extent to which Jah envisioned us to have sex was so much that it would have been pleasurable, enjoyable, and resulted in an earth full of Jah image people. But things change, right? We're now in a condition where we don't have the same earth we did then. Okay, but let me move out of that, the Genesis account. I'm just pointing out that we were made to have sex. And the only reason why the Jews were required to circumcise themselves was because of when Jah freed them from Exodus, and this is going to tie into the law of Moses and what it says there about homosexuality, he took them on as a people. He bought them from Egypt, it says, essentially. Destroyed the Egyptian culture at that time and brought the Israelites to where they are today. So they were his property, and it was through them that he was bringing or developing a people. I mean literally developing a people, both by separating them into tribes and groups and having laws that would protect them from other races, other groups during this time when he was bringing his son's body around. It says right there in Psalms, quoted in Hebrews, "You prepared a body for me." Jah was preparing his son's body so that when he came to the earth, it would be ready for him to live in and be more adequately prepared to do Jah's will. That's what the Bible teaches. That's why Jah was so protective of the nation of Israel. That's why he didn't tolerate any of these things, and people were put to death if they practiced them. He was serious. This is not a game. Humans were in a condition where all of us were dying with no redemption, and he was going to send his own son to do what Adam did not do and to show that Satan was wrong and that all those who put faith in the one who came into this body that he was preparing and made would be able to live again in spite of Adam and Eve's fall. Okay, so that's a brief summary of the great message, but it ties in here because, again, these laws were specific to Jah's selection of the Israelites as the people through whom he was going to develop his son's body through the line of David and then allow him to come and inhabit that body, to live in and to declare Jah's name and to ultimately die in under great trial and persecution. But even that was limited because Jah knew the effects it could have, right? He didn't allow his bones to be broken. There are limitations within the human world. And in dealing with these things, Jah can either override everything he put into place or deal with the things that have developed since the choices that were made and respond appropriately. He knows the best choices. He can develop the right solution, and that's exactly what we believe he did. So the laws of Moses were meant for that reason. Yes, they were there to protect the Israelites, but what were the Israelites there for? The whole reason the Israelites were there, that is, freed from Egypt, or even sent into Egypt, with Joseph eventually governing it before they were enslaved, right? Because of the promise made through Abraham. But the whole reason he freed them from Egypt was to have them as his property. He even tabernacled with them or tented with them through the Ark of the Covenant and all of these different things that the Jews wrote about and that are described and that we can show historically in most cases took place. That's what that was for. The entire history of the Jewish people is for one thing, the Messiah. And the bringing forth of that Messiah's body and the Spirit of Jah's Son from heaven to redeem us all. Okay, I say that, and I'm mentioning this from a Christian perspective so you understand why these laws, like Leviticus 20:13, are so severe. Let me read that to you. It says in Leviticus 20:13, "And when a man lies down with a male, the same as one lies down with a woman, both of them have done a detestable thing. They should be put to death without fail. Their own blood is upon them." Okay, now, this is not the only group of people who were put to death for doing these kinds of things. You could read that entire chapter of Leviticus 20, and you'll see that for the most part, it was heterosexuals who were put to death for inappropriate sexual activity with people like their relatives, or especially the wife of another man. So the laws of Moses, and in particular in Leviticus chapter 20, are not anti-homosexual in the sense that they exclusively are written against the practice of homosexual sex. As I mentioned, all of these laws were written in order to keep the Israelites as clean as possible as a sinful people, during which time Jah was bringing forth the Messiah through the line of David. Homosexuality, even though it has a pleasurable aspect, right? I mean, any kind of simulated sex, homosexuality, pansexuality, meaning sex with all. I didn't really define that properly because we got off on a related topic, but the pansexuality group, pansexuals being those who basically will have sex with everything, even corpses and children. Some will make exclusions. I think even Miley Cyrus says no corpses, right? But either way, many pansexuals will include corpses. And you're going to see this pedophilia develop even further because the pansexuality group absolutely includes sex with children. It's all related to the god Pan. Pan is the Greek word for all, so it basically means all with anything. But it is also the name of the god of a god. That relates back ultimately, I believe, to Cush, Nimrod's father, but that has taken on these different forms. And so you have all these different movies today about Peter Pan. That's about the god Pan. And even the Egyptian god Ptah. Ptah Pan. That's what that is. And that's why have you ever wondered why they keep making Peter Pan movies? That's why. And then, of course, what do you have with Peter Pan? You have the Lost Boys, the children. In any case, I'm just giving you a perspective, right? This isn't like this is what they believe. I'm telling you the things that are associated with pansexuals. And so, okay, let's get back to Leviticus 20 now that I've defined them a little bit better. And we talked about how homosexuality and these different forms of simulated sex, whether it's with an opposite gender, male and male, female, or with an animal or a child or a corpse, pansexuals, that does not obviously reproduce. There is pleasure in the simulated aspect that you go through in performing the sex act that ultimately would usually lead to a climax, orgasm. And so there's pleasure there. But then, okay, think about it. If you're having sex male on male, right, males don't have vaginas. They don't have the sexual organ that women have that is designed. It's so obvious it's designed. I'm not even going to get into offense of it. You can look it up on yourself. Look up the physiology of the women's reproductive system and the males. And I'd be happy to talk to you about whether or not that's an accident or ever could be part of any accident. So in any case, if you look at the female reproductive organs, in this case the vagina, you will see that it is designed specifically with special muscles and special lubricants that allows for male-female sex that is not painful, is pleasurable, and will lead to the correct process involved in reproduction. I say correct because, again, with males on males, you don't have a vagina. You just have the anus or the anal opening. And that is not going to correctly receive male sperm in order to complete the reproductive cycle, right? What it does, when a male ejaculates into another anus, whether a male or a female, it causes immunosuppression. That means it suppresses your immune system's ability to respond to disease. In other words, your body is responding to that act and saying, whoa, you're creating a condition we have to shut down your ability to fight back on now because something's wrong. There's something happening we're not prepared to respond to, and this isn't the way that when an immune system response shuts down, that's incredibly severe. And so this is why it has led to things like AIDS and, of course, many other diseases, because also with anal sex, you don't have the same physiology. Human anuses do not have the kind of musculature that female vaginas do. They do not have the kind of lubricants that female vaginas do. They're a very thin cell wall in the anal area that tears very easily. And so now, even though we may see that as something painful and bad physiologically, right? And it is. And scientifically, this is not disputable, okay? This is not disputable. We're going to get to this article here in just a minute, and then I'm going to get to your questions. But let me wrap this up here in terms of the Bible. So the pain that you can obviously see from the homosexual act, at least the male on male or male on a female in an anal way, does not provide painless pleasure. It does not provide reproduction, and it has a lot of consequence, right? Immunosuppression, anal tearing, and proliferation of disease through contact with blood, semen, and of course fecal matter, toxic things in your anus. You know, I'm using just normal physiological terms, right? Things that you should learn in high school or should have learned or read about. And we all have a human body, right? Our best experience and understanding of these things is how do we use and how have we used our own body in the ways that we know they function. We can change that like we're talking about, right? We know the anus functions as an excretory organ, and it doesn't have muscles that go inward. It only goes outward to remove toxins and waste. You can change that, right? You can use it differently, but then there are going to be consequences like what I've talked about and what you can see scientifically. Okay, so that's a difference. You do have the simulated pleasure, that's there, but you don't have the reproduction, and you definitely will have pain and or health issues. Now with females, it's a little different, female on female, but nonetheless, you still have issues. And if you look it up, and of course, female homosexuals are given an actual category, lesbians. I don't say that in a negative way. I've never thought of that in a negative way. I've always thought of that as female homosexuals. I'm not really sure if there's a category for male homosexuals, though, which is interesting. If there is, I'd like to know that. I'm not sure, but I know lesbians refer to, as I understand it, female homosexuals. But, they have to use artificial means to create the same thing they could get from a man. No reproduction, of course, unless you do some kind of fertilization method outside of the person you're having sex with. And it does lead to things like lice and other conditions if you look it up. Whereas with heterosexuals, you're only going to get that if you have multiple partners in ways that aren't a part of what you understand. In the Bible, there are accounts where people have more than one woman, more than one wife. Christian overseers are not to have more than one wife because you're not able to give the congregation enough attention and give more than one wife attention. That's a subject for another show. But what I'm talking about is heterosexuals who just go out and have sex with anybody, right? Maybe even other homosexuals and others. The potential for incurring disease is greater, therefore, in a heterosexual relationship if that kind of person is more involved with a lot of different people. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking really more about two people. Excuse me. I understand there can be more than one partner, more than two partners in a sexual relationship. But I'm looking at it more in just two right now because it's simpler to make comparisons. So two heterosexuals, two homosexuals, Two pansexuals would really be the same as two homosexuals or heterosexuals if they were two humans, right? Because it wouldn't matter. It would just be sex with another living thing or non-living thing, potentially. So that's why I'm using more the homosexual, heterosexual categories here, because I think the pansexual and bisexuals, for the sake of the comparison I'm making in terms of pain, consequence, and the differences between a straight, one-on-one heterosexual relationship and a non-straight one-on-one homosexual relationship, you have the pleasure comparison, but it comes with a greater physiological cost. And if you're damaged physiologically, it can have an impact on your emotional state, your psychological state, and your spiritual state if you're willingly accepting that kind of thing, willingly accepting a damaging activity. You see, it's one thing for you to feel like you want to have sex with somebody else of the same gender because you have a desire for that person. And you may even think that desire is love. But if you know that fulfilling that desire is going to damage that other person, right? Because they don't have the compatible organs that you need to have non-painful, non-damaging sex, well, there is where we have the issue of what is love. Is it loving to pursue a desire if you know it's going to be painful and damaging and even take life away from another person, not just your own, right? We can all make choices about ourselves, but when it comes to someone else, is that really loving? It seems like it would be more loving to me to withhold your desire for a sexual simulated pleasure, knowing that doing that would damage that other person. And you could receive the same desire in another way or with another person without the damage and the consequence. Again, I understand people have desires and they get to choose with whom they want to fulfill them. But you see what I'm saying? The way I'm looking at it is more in terms of are you really showing love? What are the benefits? What are the consequences? And when I look at it in that way, the heterosexual model really is the only one that is capable of fulfilling everything right. When it comes to things like the law of Moses, again, that is specific to the development of the Messiah's body through the nation of Israel, specifically the line of David. And it was not tolerant of a number of things, most of which involved heterosexuals, okay? Not homosexuals. So the fact that homosexuals would be included in that is not a big deal or a surprise. It's a miracle he's tolerating us at all when you think about it. But then again, he's a father, so we understand what fathers are like, and so it makes sense in that way. Either way, I would highly recommend not testing him. But we all do, because we're all sinful in ways we've inherited from others, and we just sometimes make stupid choices. But we can recover, right? That doesn't mean we have to keep doing it. That doesn't mean we have to keep making the same bad choice. Some may struggle more than others, but the point is, are you struggling? Or have you made your choice? And if you've made your choice either way, it's your choice, right? Everyone gets to choose, at least when it comes to these kinds of things in Western society. All right, so we talked about the law of Moses. Let me reemphasize this and read from 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. And notice what Paul writes to Timothy about what the law says regarding things like homosexuality. Many of you may not be familiar with this verse. You're familiar, I'm sure, with Leviticus 20, 1 Corinthians 6, but here's what 1 Timothy 1 says, verses 8 through 11. Now we know that the law is fine, provided one handles it lawfully, in the knowledge of this fact, that law is promulgated not for a righteous man, but for persons lawless and unruly, ungodly, and sinners, lacking loving kindness, and profane, murderers of fathers, murderers of mothers, manslayers, fornicators, men who lie with males, kidnappers, liars, false swearers, and whatever other thing is in opposition to the healthful teaching. Okay, he's basically summarizing many of the things involved in the law, and he's explaining that it's for those people. It was at that time to keep them, remember they were coming out of Egypt, to keep them from continuing to do these things so as to pollute the nation of Israel as it was just starting to develop and getting ready to go into the promised land. So it should not be surprising to us that people have these problems or issues. That's what the law was for, because we were having these problems and issues, and for Jah to select a special people like the Israelites and dwell with them for centuries until the Messiah had come, the law was necessary for those people. And so, again, we can see that the benefits, the differences between heterosexual sex and homosexual sex are pretty evident, the simulated pleasure aside. But that having been said, let me read this article that was shared in the comments by another viewer, and then I'm going to get to your questions right after this, okay? I'm going to share with you this article from ScienceDaily.com. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's fairly brief, but I think it covers things well. All right, here's what it says. Excuse me. It's entitled Homosexuality. I'll put a link in the description. Homosexuality. Homosexuality can refer to both attraction or sexual behavior between people of the same sex or to a sexual orientation. When describing the latter, it refers to enduring sexual and romantic attraction toward those of the same sex, but not necessarily to sexual behavior. I think that was consistent with how we defined it. Homosexuality is contrasted with heterosexuality, bisexuality, and asexuality. Lesbian denotes a homosexual woman, like I also said. Most scientists today agree that sexual orientation is most likely the result of a complex interaction of environmental, cognitive, and biological factors. Although homosexuality does not appear to be adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint, because homosexual sex does not produce children, there is evidence of its existence through human history. And that's true. Even, I believe, in reading some of the volumes of history regarding the Roman times, in the first century, they were known as the analists. That's what they were called. That was their designation as a group. Okay, so back to the article. Just two more small paragraphs here. Although a number of biological factors have been considered by scientists, such as prenatal hormones, chromosomes, polygenetic effects, brain structure, and viral influences, no scientific consensus exists as to how biology influences sexual orientation. Most scientists agree, this is the last paragraph, most scientists agree that it is unlikely that there is a single quote-unquote gay gene that determines something as complex as sexual orientation, and that it is more likely to be the result of an interaction of genetic, biological, and environmental cultural factors. Okay, so just so we want to be fair, make sure that this point is carried through. Even though the article clearly states that there's not an agreement on the identification of a gay gene, that there's something in our DNA that would determine whether a person is homosexual or not, or any of the other sexuals that I mentioned, other than hetero. That's the normal cycle that we see hereditarily. It does believe that biological factors and genetic interaction of genetic, biological, environmental play a part. So the article, even though it is honest in admitting that there's no actual evidence, so if there were actual evidence, then there'd be agreement, right? If it was a scientific fact that there was a gene that determined whether you were homosexual or not, then that would be identifiable. It would be objective, and we could say there it is. So that has not happened. But nonetheless, the article does believe there is a connection or some interrelation between genetics and these other factors. All right, so however, even though there may be, in the way I see it, in my experience, is based on interactions with a number of homosexuals over time, or people, and in studying life and my own self and reading what others have had to say, it seems to me possible that hereditarily, hormonal differences, hormonal imbalances that are not typical of one gender or the other. So in a case where a female may have elevated testosterone and where a male may have elevated estrogen or lowered testosterone, those kinds of conditions appear to me to be involved as a factor. And so I would agree with the article here that that kind of condition, if it's hereditary, that is your hormonal. I'm not talking about forced deprivation of hormones or hormone therapy to influence what would naturally be the case if a person developed without that kind of suppression or manipulation. That happening on its own, where a person has lower or higher levels of hormones that are typical to one gender or the other, it seems to me to lend itself to that person being influenced otherwise to accept an alternate lifestyle or a homosexual lifestyle. So I do see that. However, I'm not convinced that there is anything in the DNA other than whatever might result in that condition that would determine that a person's gay. And so it would seem to me to be more of a deficiency of some kind or an excess that's not appropriate for what is typically biologically measured out in the reproductive process for that gender. And so I'm not calling it a mistake. It's a consequence of our human development over time that involves a number of different things. We have heterosexuals with an excess of testosterone, and some of them go crazy, right, and do things that are not right. We have women who have also hormonal imbalances of one kind or another, who can have conditions as a result of it. So this is a part of life, right? We need to be prepared to deal with people who biologically may have developed in ways that are not typical of other males or females, so that they do feel different. They do respond different. And it's more difficult for them as a result. It's very important that we keep that in mind, because even though as a Christian or as a Jew or as a Muslim, as whomever who just may believe in the normal heterosexual model of sex and the normal binary gender of male versus female, or male and female. We'll get to transgenders in a minute. It's important that we understand that this kind of potential biological interrelation with environmental and other factors, and cultural, right? And of course, a lot of homosexuals have been abused as children. And so I say that because it's true. And the abuse familiarizes them with that kind of sex practice. So if you're abused as a child, if you're anally raped or anally taken advantage of, as you get older, that's not going to seem as unusual to you. We need to keep that in mind. A person who's been through a difficult early upbringing can be more familiar with the process in ways that make it more difficult for them to resist. But again, if the experience was not a good one and it was painful or otherwise, I think as you develop, if you're on good people, you can come to appreciate that was just something done to you that was not right. But I can't speak to all of those different situations, excuse me, nor do I want to. What I want to do is to try to develop an understanding about the sexuals. That's every one of us. And how we can better understand ourselves, other people, and get along in spite of our disagreement over something that's very important. Okay, so I think my little episode of dry throat is a sign that I need to look at the questions. So I think I covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in terms of getting the show going. So what I'll do now, I'm going to take a look and see what we have. Some of the questions I notice as they're happening, but others I don't always see. So, excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry. I know it can be tough. I don't mean to describe things in a sexual way for younger children, but at some point it has to be done. They're comment in the chat that they're 15-year-olds listening, and I understand. But I think the terms I used were pretty typical. They're just not commonly used because these subjects are sensitive, and I believe that's a problem, right? Because people's sensitivity over these things on TV, on news, and in shows is what prevents us from getting to the differences and the details that we really need to know. Yes, it is personal in some way. It's sensitive, and it may embarrass one or more of us a little bit, but I would rather go over this together and have a little bit of embarrassment, right? And give you information that I think will help you deal with these situations or deal with these conditions, versus having to go through them yourself, apart from any kind of discussion where we were kind of open and honest with the differences among us, but yet still trying to keep us all in one group as human sexuals. I think that will help. I think that will go a long way to allowing us to work better together socially, to respect each other when it comes to our religious or non-religious beliefs and differences. But it's not going to be easy, because sex is very important to people, important to everybody. And when you talk about it, you end up describing things in ways, like I just said, that can be personal or they can offend people. But I'm willing to take that risk so that we can get closer to what's most important, and that is an understanding. If we have an understanding about other people and ourselves and why we do or don't do something, versus just doing it because someone says, hey, do this or do that, or we're kind of whimsical, that is going to lead to chaos and destruction. But when you have understanding, when you know why you're doing or not doing something, you can tell that person. Maybe you'll have a person who's a homosexual, they find you attractive, you're a male, they're a male, and you can tell they're interested. You need to be able to deal with them in the same way that you might deal with an unwanted person of the opposite gender. And tactfully but firmly state your position. Say, listen, I'm not gay. I'm not a homosexual. I'm not anti-homosexual, but I don't do it because I think it's damaging to me and to the other person. I like sex. I just don't think that's a healthy way to have it. But if you do, there's all kinds of things that people do that may not be healthy. But I'm not here to tell people how to live their lives. But I make my choices for these reasons. Something like that. Be very open and honest, but try to keep it simple. You don't have to get into a great detailed discussion of human anatomy. I just did a little bit of that because we do need to understand conceptually, physically, what is involved with these practices and what is involved with heterosexual sex. How can you have a loving relationship with somebody? I'm not going to get into that too much. The more things that we have and we know as people, part of our human understanding development. But of course, that kind of thing is more of a one-on-one thing if someone has a problem. I'm not here to be a sex coach. I'm here to be a understanding coach. I try to give us understanding of some of these things. Yeah, I know. Drink some water. No, I'm better now. I went on a little while there and I could feel it coming, but I thought I could get past it. So either way, it's okay. Now, I want to get to this question here. And so Benzie Roy, as always, has an interesting question. If it's hormonal changes of estrogen or testosterone, then Jah may agree isn't, as it's not their problem. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. And of course, a lot of the questions we get are from people around the world. So I wouldn't be able to speak their language correctly, exactly, but they're doing a better job with my language than I would with theirs. So I think I understood. I just read it directly, so if it didn't make sense, I think what the question is, she's basically being sympathetic, or he's being sympathetic, Benzie Roy. It looks like two of them, so I'm not sure who's asking the question. Toward the understanding that we can have for a person that we can see is more feminine, if it's a male, than they would normally be, and they have a documented or evident hormonal imbalance, or a woman who's more masculine than most women are. See, those conditions are not as easy for that person to control, right? Try reining in your hormones. That's not easy to do. We're all imperfect and we struggle with that on a daily basis. Now, try reining in your hormones when you have a sexual interest for someone of the same gender. It may even be more difficult, right? Because you're in a body that's designed for a role you may or not be willing to perform because of the imbalance of hormones surging through you. And again, I'm not here to make excuses for things. We all make our choices. We all make mistakes, and we have a loving Father, we believe. And we should be loving towards each other, right? None of us are doing every single thing perfectly and correctly. And yes, some do things more openly wrong than others, right? It's not like we then adopt a position where every single thing is acceptable because we all do mistakes, right? Then we just end up accepting every mistake. So the idea is to be accepting of people for the reasons we make mistakes. We're sinful. That we've inherited. Okay, you want to talk about inheriting something. This question of the homosexual gene, the gay gene, that the article from Science Daily talked about, that doesn't exist by any consensus in science. I would say it's pretty obvious that we've all inherited imperfections from other people, right? By imperfections, I mean habits, qualities, personality traits because of our DNA, part of which is received from one or both of our parents. Well, it's all received, but I'm saying we get part of it from one, part of it from another. And this involves part of who they are. So we are for sure, if we are to be understanding toward homosexuals or others because it's potentially a part of their biology, let me tell you something. We need to be understanding to everybody where it concerns mistakes or difficult situations where they made bad choices, because we've inherited that for sure. Now, whether that inheritance also includes things like sexual orientation, again, there's no consensus. But I think we've all seen cases where we've acted like somebody we're related to, or somebody sees the same trait in us they saw in the other, the relative or the parent. I've seen that. And that seems to be the case because we even look like others physically when we're related to them, physically and in our DNA. So we're inheriting all this stuff, and we get to use it ourselves and develop and make our own choices and change the way things are to the extent that we have the ability to control ourselves, right? Just because we have a desire for one thing because we inherited that doesn't mean we can't look at it factually, scientifically, logically, and say, I want to do that, but that's going to end up doing this, and it's going to be bad for me, so you know what? No, I'm not going to do it. Okay, and then you succeeded there. That's good. Maybe you failed another time, but then you felt bad about it, and you go back. These are the kinds of things people go through. And to the extent we can make it easier for everyone to go through that, I say we do it, because we're not going to make any friends, and we're not going to benefit ourselves or others by making it harder, more difficult. That doesn't mean I'm not going to quote texts that say, you're not supposed to be a liar, you're not supposed to be, worship idols. You're not supposed to be out there having sex with everything, regardless of the consequences. Because I'm held to that same standard, and I make some of the very same mistakes, and I go through the same process of repenting or dealing with the consequences from Jah. No one gets away. And then I try to make the better decisions, right? Because with the better decisions, if with the bad decisions we get consequences, well, with the good decisions, we get the rewards. And I see that too. I see that all the time, just like I see the consequences follow from bad decisions. So everybody gets to choose. We believe that. And even though King Solomon, according to the records, later fell due to the ways of the many women that he had, he also taught Jah's will and wisdom to a great extent. And he, long before people like Aleister Crowley, said, whatever your hand finds to do, do. Do whatever you want. But he also said, know this, whatever you do, the true God is going to come to you and have an accounting for every single thing you did. So I believe that's true. I've seen that in ways my whole life. And I've come to believe in the biblical records as representing in large part the history and wisdom of Jah in relation to people on this earth and to the founding of the earth itself. But this show was meant to be about the sexuals. That's all of us. We're all sexuals, but we're not all the same sexual. But I think it's good for us to know, before I get to one other question here, I think it's good for us to know that when, in one sense at least, we all share the same category of or categorization. We're all in the same group. We're all sexuals. Unless, of course, you're asexual or have a condition where that's not the case. I'm not talking about the exceptions in that way. I'm talking about more often than not, by far, we are all sexuals. Most of us are heterosexual. The numbers show that, meaning we like to have sex or are attracted to people of the opposite gender. But you also do have transgenders, right? People who have a gender identity, I'll say issue because it's not typical. And there is a conflict between their physiology and their gender identity. So it's an issue. And it can often lead to things like manipulation of a person's body, right? Changing parts of your body so that you look more like the gender that you identify with, which you identify with. The gender with which you identify. And, but that doesn't change your DNA. That doesn't change your chromosomes. It just changes part of your body to make you look more like something you believe you are. But let me take this into a different realm. So we're being taught today that transgenders who identify in this way identify as a gender different than the physiology that would show what their gender is. That we have to respect their identification regardless of our own view. And I'm willing to do that if the person really believes that's who they are. What I'm not willing to do is to say that their physiology is that of the gender with which they identify. I'm willing to identify and accept them as the gender they want to be or believe they are. But physiologically, they're still the thing you can show scientifically. Male or female. Doesn't matter if they chopped off certain things or added certain things. That does not add to your DNA. It doesn't take away from your DNA. So I would certainly, remember, we're to give honor to those who call for it. And while that's used in more of a political context, the fact is it's fairly broad. And if a transgender person wants to be identified a certain way, I'm happy to do that. But if they tell me, I want you to say my body is this way or that way, and it's not, I'd say, no, that's factually incorrect. I can't tell them what they're factually in their mind, right? I can't, nor do I want to get into a dispute over that. But I can prove what their gender is according to their body. So that's what I wanted to add on the gender issue there. We'll talk more in other shows, I'm sure, about the gender spectrum, maybe a show more specific to gender issues. This was really about sexuals. All of us, pretty much. And the differences between heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, pansexual. How we can understand each other better. And as a result, better understanding usually leads to better relations. It's usually when you don't understand somebody or you're confused or you have the wrong idea that chaos develops or a misunderstanding that could have been avoided. And I wanted to try to develop a discussion that would help people interact socially and otherwise if you happen to get along and still have your own position and to be able to disagree and say, no, I don't do that. Well, why don't you do that? Well, I believe it's bad for me and for another person. Well, I do it. Well, that's fine. You're entitled to your own belief, just like I'm entitled to mine. And that's how that discussion should go. And then if you decide you want to hang out further, fine. But just know I don't do that. And I know what you do. So we'll both avoid that and we'll both do what we want to do, or we'll just say hi and bye. Right? That's about as simple as you can make it. You do not have to get close with people who do not share your personal views on things like sex. You can, if they're willing to just accept your position, not try to compromise your view, and you the same for them, if that's what you want to do. But more often than not, you're going to find better company with those who have similar views, because then you'll be able to potentially develop the same interests. All right, let me get back to the questions here. And let's do one more. So we have a question. My son asks, if it's natural for his friends to be gay, how is he wrong? He is born that way. What answer can I give him? Is he a sinner? Well, I mean, he's your son, and hopefully I've given enough information, excuse me. Anyone who does something that Jah didn't make us to do is a sinner, right? So that's all of us. We've all done something that Jah didn't make us to do, but we believe because of Jesus, we don't have to offer sacrifices according to the law to show repentance for the things we do wrong, so that Jah lets us keep living in the earth until our bad choices eventually catch up with us. We believe that we're allowed to make choices, even wrong ones, if we repent and try to change. Now, if you're talking about someone who knows what they're doing, everyone knows what they're doing. We know what the consequences are, and we can see the actions. So we don't want to make too many excuses for ourselves or others. But if a person chooses to practice something and they're not concerned with the consequences, well, then just leave them be. Just say, you know what, as long as they're not damaging you or damaging your home, just say, look, we love you as a person. That doesn't mean we always agree with everything you choose or that you'll agree with everything we choose. But our choices are based on the best reasons, best evidence, which includes our physiology, the consequences of our decisions, and, of course, scientific studies that show that heterosexual sex, when done correctly, is the most pleasurable, the least painful, and the most rewarding. You can have children, you can have a cohesive family where people function together and develop and grow strong communities in countries and nations and worlds. The very opposite of what some people are trying to do today, it seems, with the promotion of things that are destructive. I'm not talking about people who promote things or different ways in heterosexual sex because they believe they're good. There are many homosexuals and others who just believe that their way is appropriate and they want to stand up for the rights of their own category of sexuals. And they feel they've been abused or persecuted, so they have more indignation toward others who would tell them what to do. It doesn't change the consequences. All of that may be true. Tell your son or tell anyone else, excuse me, are you ready to accept the consequences of what you do? If the answer is yes, then you cannot force that person to do something else. You can love them, you can tell them what you think is best, and you can give them whatever help and support you believe is appropriate and not supportive of things you believe are destructive. But ultimately, all of us have to make decisions. And if we realize we've made decisions that are not good, we can also make a decision to change. Just because we've done bad things, right? I could point to almost every person in the Bible, except Jesus, and point out bad things, really bad things, like murder, racism, you name it. And then they went on to do a lot of good and were used. You know why? Because that's all Jah has to use. People like you and me who make mistakes, but most of the time are trying to do what's right. I believe we are. I believe if you're listening to this show and you're like me, I think you're trying to be a good person. You're trying to help others. You're trying to take care of yourself. You may have excess choices here or there that wouldn't fit that model, but again, our desires sometimes get the better of us. But what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to take yourself down a path where you ignore all the consequences you know are coming until they actually get here? Or are you trying to look down the path and see what's coming and make sure that when it gets here, it's what you want? As long as you're willing to accept the consequences of your actions, then you have to be allowed to make the choices that bring you to those consequences. So I'm a big believer, entirely in fact, in empowering individuals to make choices, to give good reasons, so that you can be confident, comfortable, and hopefully make the right decision. What's the right decision? The right decision is the one with the most benefits and the least consequences. Seems obvious to me. But I make bad choices anyway when it comes to some of those same things. So it's again about what you're ultimately trying to do. And when you make mistakes, how do you respond? Remember, I gave an analogy the other day about a tree producing fine fruit and a tree producing rotten fruit. We all have fruit, if we're figurative trees. And most of our fruit is probably pretty good. If we take care of ourselves, water the tree, good soil, and it's in appropriate lighting. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be a bad piece here or a bad piece there, or a worm is going to get in a piece here, and someone's going to pull that piece and be, oh, this fruit off your tree. Sorry about that. Here, try this piece. You see? So we have to sometimes be self-pruning. Otherwise, Jah will prune us, or somebody else will pick a piece of fruit off and say, what's this? You know. And again, we all fit that category. We're all sexuals, right? If we could only stop there. But we can't, because we're more than that as well. But let's try to keep that in mind. We're all sexuals. And to the extent that we can get along in spite of our sexual differences, let's do it. Let's try to work things out. If we don't have the same views on sex, then limit your involvement with other people. If family members are insistent on pursuing a sexual course that's different from yours, show them what love you can. Allow them to pursue it. The consequences are there, good or bad. So everyone will get them. And then it's a question of whether or not they're able to get past it, and then how they react. So never give up on someone. I would say that for sure, because we can all get into positions where we feel like we're trapped or we've made choices we can't get out from. That's not true. That's the whole point of the great message. That it doesn't matter what you've done, even if on your last day, like the criminal who was executed alongside Jesus, even if at the very end you realize the mistakes you made and you genuinely confess them, we have a loving Father. And the sons of God are also very loving. They're asexual, of course, according to what we read and according to what Jesus taught us. They're neither male nor female. So, but yet and still they're called sons of Jah. So that's the Bible's terms, the way they refer to them. And that's because men were made first, and from men, women were made. That's not a bad thing. That's just the order of operations, right? How would we know any better than the one who put down the order of operations? And if women were made from men, that explains why men are so attracted to women, because they are a part of us. They're made from us. We are one with them, or can be. That's the desire each male and female has because of that connection we believe Jah made between humans in the Garden of Eden. But of course, as I said, we've made choices since then. We appreciate the fact that others, homosexuals, non-heterosexual people, can find pleasure and what they consider love in their relationships. And to the extent that they can, we're not here to stand in your way. But we are here to promote what we believe is the correct, healthy model of sexual relations, and to also promote that people are entitled to make their own decisions so long as they're not taking advantage of somebody else against their will. And so that's today's show. I appreciate all of you for watching, and thank you. I'll be back next week for another CWJah Talk show, number 10, and I'll release the title later this week.